in the cozy parlor of Major McLaughlin's agency residence. Just a few nights ago, close to midnight and with the air outside as icy as the gaze of a hostel, sat the Major, his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Spotted Horn Bull, and a correspondent from the Pioneer Press. Major McLaughlin had already heard parts of the story the Native Americans had to share, but after skillful questioning, the full account was recounted, with Mrs. McLaughlin, fluent in Sioux, serving as the interpreter. The woman did most of the talking, while her husband, a dark-complexioned hunk papa of commanding stature and a reputation for unmatched bravery, appeared proud of her intelligence and storytelling skills. The wife, clad in clean, brightly colored calico, a wide leather belt heavily studded with brass nails cinching her waist, and possessing a radiant copper complexion, lively eyes that sparkled with humor yet occasionally flashed with the fierce intensity that makes an enraged Sioux woman a fearsome presence even in her own camp, presented a striking figure. Her perfect, gleaming teeth, uncommon for an indigenous woman past 30, added to her vivid presence. The Major, as was customary for Indian agents, a title used out of respect, introduced her by noting that she was a first cousin to Sitting Bull and one of the most notable figures in her community. Only days earlier, she had confronted the formidable Gaul, preventing him from casting aside one wife, who happened to be her relative, in favor of another. It later became clear that her narrative about the Battle of the Little Bighorn had been shared many times with Sitting Bull, whose esteem for her remained high, often nodding in agreement to her recollections. Her storytelling was impossible to describe adequately. Her gestures were frequent and expressive, such that a skilled interpreter of signs, like Philo Clark of Sheridan's staff, might have followed her account purely from her movements. And so, the tale unfolded, layered in both words and signs. 11 days before the battle with Custer, the Sioux had set up camp some distance from what is now called the Little Bighorn, known to them as the Greasy Grass, and held a solemn sun dance, remnants of which were later observed by soldiers. Although he was long excused from enduring its pains and rituals, Sitting Bull, more of a medicine man and advisor than a warrior, participated by being tied to the pole of suffering. The scars from the ritual, where his chest muscles were pierced, remained visible as evidence of his endurance. Others either broke free from their bindings or succumbed to the ordeal of pain and fasting, but Sitting Bull, instead of struggling, appeared deeply contemplative. For 2 days and nights, he neither ate nor drank. On the morning of the third day, he collapsed. During his unconscious state, his loyal wives and friends, among them the narrator, managed to give him food and water. When he recovered, he spoke with great seriousness about a vision he had during his trance. He described a dream in which it was revealed that his people would soon face Custer and his troops, and they would utterly defeat them. 2 mornings after this vision, 7 days before the Custer fight, just as dawn broke, a large group of Crows launched an attack on the Sioux. The battle lasted all day. It did not seem to be particularly fierce, as only 7 Sioux lost their lives, while the Crows, although eventually beaten, managed to retrieve all but one of their fallen warriors before retreating into the heights of the Wolf Mountains. The Sioux viewed their victory as costly and not especially noteworthy. Although Mrs. Tatanka claimed the Crow forces numbered in the thousands, her husband gave a skeptical grunt in disagreement. The following morning, the Sioux dismantled their camp and moved to the lush valley of the Little Bighorn. This new location, now historic, was about 14 miles south of what is now Fort Custer, situated where the Bighorn and Little Bighorn rivers converge, and, according to the speaker's recollection, approximately 30 miles from the site of the Crow battle. The remains of the 7 Sioux were transported to the new encampment using travois and placed in a teepee situated at the far right, or southernmost point, of the teepee village, which soon extended nearly 5 miles along the river's western bank. A correspondent who had visited the battlefield in August 1882 was well acquainted with the terrain and notable landmarks of the area. To assess the accuracy of Mrs. Tatanka's recollections, she was asked a series of questions, all of which she answered with ease. Finally, straightening herself with an air of pride, she declared, "Why wouldn't I know this place? It is part of my land." Like many of the Sioux, she displayed a natural skill for illustration. Taking a visiting card and pencil, and occasionally consulting her husband, she sketched the accompanying diagram, explaining that it would clarify her account. She later supplemented it with a rough map of the area's waterways, covering the streams from the Missouri River in the north to the Little Missouri in the east. When asked about the number of warriors gathered by the 7 tribes mentioned, the narrator could not provide a precise figure. However, after an extended and, to a non-native observer, complex calculation, her husband estimated that 5,000 would account for both the braves and chiefs. This figure is likely accurate or close, as it aligns with the assessments of experienced scouts who observed the encampment before and after the battle. As illustrated on the diagram, the river flows nearly northward at the battle site. On the west bank, where the native groups were camped, the terrain is flat. The 5 northern tribes were situated on the level ground near the river, while the other 2 occupied the first elevated tier, a rise of approximately 4 to 6 feet. Beyond this, to the west and south, the plain stretches further. On the east side of the river, where the soldiers approached, the terrain is steep. At Point G, where Reno established his shallow fortifications, the elevation reaches at least 200 feet above the river, which at this location is shallow enough to ford with ease. Point K marks the highest ground's furthest edge, to which Captains Benteen and Weir ascended before regrouping with Reno. However, they could not spot any sign of Custer from there. The site where Reno crossed during his retreat is marked on the plain leading to that crossing. Labeled him, Lieutenant McIntosh was dragged from his horse and killed, while Hodgson lost his life at the ford. The descent into the river on the side where the native forces were located involves a bank only a few feet high. Conversely, the bluff on the opposite shore rises at an angle exceeding 45 degrees. It would have been impossible for troops, unless overwhelmed by panic, to scale such a slope. The fact that some survived is later explained by Mrs. Tatanka, who recounts a moment of disarray among the native forces. The climb from the riverbank to the breastworks is steep but manageable, and the retreating troops made the ascent quickly despite their exhausted horses. The lower line on the diagram represents the first elevated tier. Below this tier, closer to the river, lies a moderately thick growth of willows and cottonwoods. On the upper plain, trees are sparse. At the location marked H, where Custer fell, the terrain is elevated, treeless, and rolling. The slope leading down to the river here is gentler compared to areas farther south. The line labeled I denotes a small seasonal streambed that typically carries water in June but dries up later in the year. The Indian woman resumed her narrative after sketching the diagram and describing the locations of the various camps. She explained that, early in the morning of the battle on June 25th, 7 Cheyennes set out southeastward to join Spotted Tail. According to her account, 5 of them managed to proceed without issue. However, 2 of the riders went to the crest of the bluffs and used their blankets to signal that a large contingent of white soldiers was approaching at speed. These troops, the scouts confirmed, were Custer's. Following the signals, while the camp was thrown into confusion, Reno's force unexpectedly arrived from the south, on the western bank of the river, and began firing. The white soldiers dismounted, and the narrator described how 1 man remained behind to manage 4 horses, following the standard practice for dismounted combat on the frontier. The camp erupted into chaos, with women and children screaming in fear. At that moment, over half the men were away tending the pony herd. As the woman recounted this, her voice grew more animated. The leader of those troops, Major Reno, must have been either drunk or out of his mind. He had the camp completely at his mercy and could have either destroyed us all or forced us to flee, stripped of everything, across the prairie. I don't think a single shot was fired when his men first began to retreat. Her husband added, not much shooting by the Indians. But as soon as they started fleeing, they ran with great speed, abandoning their weapons and ammunition along the way. By then, our warriors were ready and killed many of them as they crossed the plain toward the river, while they were in the water and on the hill beyond. I saw boys drag men from their horses and kill them on the ground. Multiple times, this Sioux storyteller expressed her deep disdain for the actions of the whites. The only reasoning she could provide for the retreat was that Reno, upon realizing the size of the Indian village, was overcome by a panic even greater than that experienced by the Indians themselves. However, the fear among the latter was evident, as proven by the fact that the warriors, hastily returning with the quickly gathered herds, encountered numerous individuals fleeing from the camp and feared the worst upon their own return. The retreat under Reno, along with the ensuing slaughter, had barely concluded when the sound of Custer's bugles signaled his approach to the Sioux. Yet, they were ready for him. The warriors swiftly crossed the river and, in great numbers, rode to his rear, initially staying out of range but soon closing in by using the terrain of ridges and hollows, encircling him in ever-tightening rings. Mrs. Tatanka mounted her pony and rode to a vantage point just behind her camp, from which she could clearly observe the distant hills. From there, she watched the troops arrive, dismount, and assign every fourth man to manage the reins of 3 additional horses alongside his own. The remaining soldiers advanced quickly toward the river. She witnessed the devastating impact of the relentless gunfire from the willows on the Indian side of the stream, and she laughed as she remarked, "Our people, even the young boys, had plenty of weapons and ammunition to defeat the new soldiers. Those who fled left their supplies behind. Our people, even the boys, had plenty of firearms and ammunition to confront the new soldiers. Those who fled left these behind." Moving slowly northward along the edge of the camp, she observed the warriors who had crossed, advancing closer to the soldiers. She noticed the latter, those who remained, falling back to their horses and mounting them. She could hear the cries of her kin and the shouts of the soldiers. But soon, as the warriors became more numerous and the troops fewer, she could make out little else beyond scattered groups of animated men and horses. Her pony steadily made its way down the stream, and she reached the Minneconjou camp at the farthest left, less than an hour's ride. She later remarked that no white soldiers could be seen on the battlefield. There were, however, many horses. The warriors spared these, naturally. Tatanka himself described the horses as strong and healthy, but making a slow, deliberate motion with both hands, capable only of a sluggish canter, unlike the swift Indian ponies that darted like birds, weaving in and out of the shattered formations of the troopers. Less than 50 minutes passed, and more than 5 lives were lost every minute. From the husband, one event from the day was recounted. He mentioned that one individual, believed to be an officer, was the last to remain alive. Mounted on an exceptional horse, its color now forgotten, and seeing his companions all dead, the man began riding up the ravine labeled I on the diagram. Pursuing him were 2 Ogalallas, 2 Unsipapas, and a Brule, all on well-conditioned horses. He outdistanced them all, causing each to drop out of the chase one by one until only the Unsipapa, who was discovered to be unarmed, continued the pursuit. Note: Flying Hawk identified this final pursuer as Crazy Horse. Just as the Unsipapa seemed ready to abandon the chase, the man turned, noticed his pursuer, and, realizing his own horse was tiring, drew a revolver from the holster on his hip and took his own life. He had a fine horse, said Tatanka, and the Sioux, mentioning his Indian name, rode it for years afterward. The Sioux estimated the distance covered during the pursuit to be about 7 miles from the battlefield, though it could have been longer. Lieutenant Harrington's body was never recovered or recognized, and this tragic act of self-destruction might have been his. After Custer and his command were killed, the Sioux redirected their focus to the troops positioned on the hill, Reno and Benteen's forces. The woman, continuing her account, laughed with delight as she described how much enjoyment the warriors had shooting at the soldiers who ran the harrowing gauntlet down the hill to the river to fetch water. Note: George Herendeen and Peter Thompson recounted the nightmare of the water detail. Naturally, the Custer men were stripped soon after, and the only way the Indians recognized they had killed the long-haired chief was by his distinctive buckskin coat trimmed with beaver fur, which they discovered on his body. The Sioux suffered the loss of 30 warriors, with more than twice that number injured. Among those killed were boys as young as 12 and 14 who, in their youthful enthusiasm as budding warriors, charged across the river on their ponies into the heart of the battle. She spoke of 2 boys who were wounded. One, likened to a young Achilles, was hit in the heel, and another lost his right arm. Both survived, and neither has yet reached the age of 20, despite 7 years passing since they earned their first coups. With a tone of evident regret, the woman recounted the large amounts of paper money found and discarded, entirely unaware of its value. To them, these green, curiously painted rectangles held no meaning. She candidly remarked, "We understand them better now, and we wouldn't lose them as we did at that time." Naturally, celebrations and praise were the focus of the days and nights following the massacre, but the news of Terry's advancing forces with his troops prompted a quick dispersal of the camp. She mentions they marched day and night for several days, and soon the entire group found refuge in the remote areas of the Bighorn Mountains, where they stayed for a while before eventually parting ways. The Unsi-Papas and some members of other tribes traveled north. The woman's account was told plainly, and without a doubt, she believes every word to be true. Neither she nor her husband had any knowledge that the story would be published, and the sight of a pencil and notebook would have immediately stopped the conversation. The correspondent was introduced as a friend by Major McLaughlin, and the story was shared as one that would be of interest but of no particular importance to those listening. When asked if the bodies of the Custer command had been heavily mutilated, the woman replied, almost angrily, no, but later admitted that several scalps had been taken. The account as recorded by Major McLaughlin during 1908-9, told in the first person, is translated as closely as possible from the far more harmonious Lakota. A lengthy narrative, rich with dramatic imagery typical of Indian speech, it differs only slightly in content from the Pioneer Press Report of 1883. The arrangement of the various tribal circles is not exactly the same, nor does she mention the 7 Cheyennes who left the camp early on June 25th, 2 of whom returned to signal from the heights across the river, indicating the approach of Custer's troops. Her later version states that Custer's column was first spotted when 6 to 8 miles away by some women and children who were gathering Indian turnips on the east side of the river. As in the Pioneer Press account, she emphasizes that Reno's attack was a complete surprise, which, had it been timely and pressed, might have severely weakened the Sioux' strength. However, Reno attacked prematurely, before Custer was in position to strike, allowing the Indians to focus on Reno first. After defeating him, they turned on Custer, whose forces were met with overwhelming opposition and quickly destroyed. She describes Reno's battle in the valley as follows: like fire swept by a fierce wind, the warriors of the Hunkpapa, the Blackfeet, the Oglalas, and the Minneconjou charged through the village and into the trees, where the soldiers of the white leader had halted. If the soldiers had waited until they were fully prepared for the assault, if they had brought their horses and ridden into the Sioux camp, the strength of the Dakota nation could have been shattered, and our young men would have been struck down by surprise, for they were focused solely on Long Hair. But the Great Spirit was guarding his red children. He allowed the white leader, Reno, to attack prematurely, and the Sioux braves overwhelmed his soldiers and trampled them down like corn before a storm. They fought briefly, and the warriors struck them down and killed many. Those who did not make it across the river were slain, and Long Hair, Custer, was still 3 miles away. 24 of the Bluecoats lay dead on the battlefield, and our people took their rifles and many rounds of ammunition. The shadow of the sun had not shifted more than the length of a tepi pole from the start to the finish of the initial fight. Her vivid depiction of the Indian assault that overwhelmed Custer like the rush of a tidal wave is profoundly dramatic, and to fully experience the power of her narrative, one must read it in its entirety. Even a brief summary like the one that follows leaves the reader on edge. Here, in the quoted passage which necessarily excludes all but the essence of the account, is what she conveyed. Down the Greasy Grass River, across from the camps of the Cheyennes and the Sans Arcs, there is an easy crossing. From Long Hair's movements, the Sioux warriors understood that he had planned to attack my people's camp from the lower side, just as Reno had attacked from the upper side. Even the women recognized that Reno had struck too early. From a hill behind the camp at first, and then from the riverbank, I observed the men of our people prepare to defeat the soldiers of the Great Father. And before a shot was fired, I knew that no man who rode with Long Hair would return to tell the story of the battle that would start when the soldiers reached the river. From across the river, I could hear the sound of the bugle and saw the line of soldiers veer to the left, heading towards the river where the assault was planned. All I could see were the warriors of my people. They surged like the wind through the village, rushing down the ravine as the women went out to the grazing grounds to gather the ponies. It was done very swiftly. Our chiefs and the young men rode swiftly to the end of the village, opposite the hill where now stands the great stone erected by the whites marking the spot where Long Hair fell. Between that hill and the soldiers lay a ravine that began at the river across from the Sans Arc camp and curved all the way around the butte. In order to reach the butte, Long Hair would have to cross the ravine, but from where he marched with his soldiers, he could not see into the ravine or down to the riverbank. The warriors of my people had gathered on our side of the Greasy Grass, across from the opening of the ravine. Soon I saw a group of Cheyennes ride into the river, followed by some men from my band, then others, until hundreds of warriors were in the river and charging up into the ravine. Once several hundred had crossed the river and entered the ravine, the remaining warriors, still a vast number, moved back from the river and prepared for the attack. And I knew that the fighting men of the Sioux, many hundreds strong, were concealed in the ravine behind the hill where Longhair was marching, and he would soon be attacked from both sides. Pete, Gall, and several of his young warriors had crossed the Greasy Grass River once again after the white men had been either driven away or killed in the earlier skirmish, where he, along with some of our fighters, had been shooting at the soldiers, who were forced to retreat to the hill. When Pete, Gall, recrossed the river, many women followed his group, and we heard him instruct his men to scatter the horses of the soldiers, which were kept in small groups. With loud shouts that we could hear across the river, the young warriors stampeded the horses, and the women seized them. The Indians fought the soldiers using bullets taken from the initial group that attacked the village, and many rode the horses seized from the fleeing white men, who had taken refuge on the hill. I stayed with several other women along the Greasy Grass River's bank. I saw Crazy Horse lead the Cheyennes into the water and up the ravine. Crow King and the Hunkpapa followed them, and then Gall, who had led his young men and killed the soldiers he had been battling higher up the river, rode along the bench beside the river to where Longhair had halted with his men. I cannot recall the exact moment. The river was visible from the battlefield, and while the war cry still echoed in our ears, 2 Cheyenne attempted to cross the river, and 1 was shot and killed by Longhair's men. Then the warriors of the Sioux Nation, led by Crow King, Hump, Crazy Horse, and many other chiefs, surged from all sides of the hill. The last sight from our side of the river was a large number of gray horses. The smoke from the gunfire and the dust from the horses obscured the hill, and although the soldiers fired many shots, the Sioux aimed true, and the soldiers fell dead. The women crossed the river after the men of our village, and when we reached the hill, no soldiers were left alive, and Longhair lay dead among them. More than 200 soldiers lay dead on the hill, and the village boys shot many who were already dead, for the blood of the people was still hot and their hearts filled with anger, and they took no prisoners that day. I asked her if there was any more fighting. Not much. The men on the hill, Renos, could stay there until they needed water. Gall kept his men near the river. Some soldiers were shot as they tried to reach the water. There was some fighting too, but none of our young men were killed. That night, the Sioux, men, women, and children kindled numerous fires and danced. Their spirits lifted, for the Great Spirit had granted them a significant triumph. The people celebrated through the night, singing songs of victory, their strength unyielding. They might have attacked the soldiers who lay on what you call Reno Hill, but Gall, Crow King, and Crazy Horse refused to risk the lives of the Sioux warriors. They declared, "We will shoot at them from time to time, but we will not charge. They will fall into our hands when their thirst burns their throats and drives them mad for water." This was the advice of the chiefs, and the young men agreed with it. So, while many feasted, a few held the hill, and the soldiers remained unaware. Those who crept to the river to drink never returned alive. The following day brought more fighting, but the Sioux knew early on that many soldiers were coming from the north, prompting them to prepare for departure to new hunting grounds. Since their first battle with those who are now their friends, the Sioux had not won so decisive a victory with so little loss. 22 soldiers were counted as dead, and the cost was minimal. Thus, the Sioux triumphed over Longhair and his troops in the valley of the Greasy Grass River, an event my people recall with sorrow, but without dishonor.